June 6, 1944, 03:15 hours, northern France. The wind howled over the Normandy beaches, carrying with it the faint rumble of a distant storm. A solitary figure, shrouded in shadows, surveyed the horizon, an ocean of uncertainty. The Allied invasion force was mere hours away. But as the first light of dawn broke over the English Channel, the scene before Hitler's generals appeared almost too perfect, a battalion of tanks poised for a fierce assault on the German defences. Yet there was a terrifying secret embedded in the iron and steel of those tanks. They weren't real. In fact, they weren't even close. In a hidden workshop deep in the heart of Britain, a team of engineers worked tirelessly through the night. Their task was deceptively simple: create tanks that looked real enough to fool the best of the German military intelligence. By dawn, they had transformed ordinary wooden frames, covered with rubberized material, into mock tanks that mimicked the profile of the feared Sherman M4s. But these were no machines of war. They were hollow shells, crude in design, yet intricately detailed enough to appear menacing under the faint light of a morning mist. The operation was known as Operation Fortitude. The goal? To convince the Nazis that the Allies were preparing to launch the D-Day invasion at a different location, far from the beaches of Normandy. For months, British intelligence officers and military engineers had worked together to stage an elaborate ruse. They didn't just make fake tanks, they staged entire fake military units, complete with inflatable trucks, makeshift landing crafts, and even dummy soldiers. This elaborate mirage extended beyond the battlefield. The Allies planted false intelligence reports, gave false orders, and even created fake radio transmissions. All of this was aimed at keeping German forces distracted, giving the real invasion a better chance of success. But the most spectacular element of the operation? Those fake tanks, massive structures designed to appear from the sky as an unstoppable force. From the air, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. The German High Command believed they were seeing a formidable army poised for battle. The D-Day invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, was the largest amphibious assault in history, involving over 156,000 soldiers, 12,000 aircraft, and 5,000 ships. But none of this would have been possible without Operation Fortitude. Incredibly, this elaborate misinformation campaign was a key factor in ensuring the success of the landings. The deception made Hitler's generals believe that the Allies would land at Pas-de-Calais, a strategic port in northern France, instead of the beaches of Normandy. This misdirection kept the bulk of the German forces away from Normandy, allowing the Allies to secure the beachheads with far less resistance than anticipated. This feat of military strategy, which relied entirely on deception, offers a timeless lesson in the power of misinformation and the way perception can shape reality. The Allies didn't just use force, they used cunning, creating a parallel reality that led the Germans to misjudge the true threat. It's a striking example of how intelligence, subtlety, and psychological manipulation can be just as potent as a battalion of tanks, perhaps more so. As the sun began to rise on the fateful morning of June 6, 1944, the Allied invasion force stormed the beaches of Normandy. While the German forces were busy mobilizing to the imagined location of the fake tanks, they were caught off guard as the real assault took place. The fake tanks, still standing as a hollow shell of deception, were never needed. But their role in the greater strategy was clear. They were the smoke and mirrors that diverted attention, that created the space for victory. The beaches of Normandy were flooded with Allied troops, while the Germans scrambled to respond to an illusion they'd been sold. The success of Operation Fortitude proved that warfare was not just about firepower, it was about perception. With the Germans distracted and misled, the Allies were able to push through and establish a critical foothold in Europe. In the months that followed, the Axis powers realized they had been outsmarted, but by then it was too late. The tide of war had shifted, the deception had worked. June 6, 1944. 06:15 hours, Normandy Beach. The faint outline of tanks still lingers in the minds of those who lived through the deception, but in the shadows the real tanks rumbled forward, pushing the world closer to freedom. Those fake tanks, discarded on the battlefield, stand as silent monuments to a war that was won not just through brute force, but through cunning. In a way, it was the ultimate battle of the mind, a reminder that the greatest weapons are not always those made of steel. Back in Britain, in a facility tucked away from prying eyes, the engineers were not only tasked with building inflatable tanks, but with creating a perfect optical illusion. Each fake tank was meticulously crafted to mirror the weight, shape, and profile of a real Sherman M4, using a combination of canvas, rubber, and wood. In one corner of the workshop, a set of engineers was feverishly working on a life-sized model of a truck. Meanwhile, another team produced gigantic air-filled dummies of artillery guns, all with the same attention to detail. They even had crews made of human-sized mannequins dressed in military garb. These models weren't just for show. They were essential to creating an atmosphere of realism. Everything, from the sheen of the tires to the shadow of a soldier's silhouette, had to be perfect. They weren't building just any deception. They were laying the groundwork for a campaign that could deceive the most seasoned intelligence officers of the Third Reich. In the months leading up to D-Day, the Allies laid a comprehensive intelligence web designed to mislead the Germans about the scale and location of the invasion. False documents were intercepted and fed directly into the Nazi intelligence network, suggesting that the invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. At the same time, double agents within the German ranks provided fabricated reports about the movements of Allied forces, ensuring that Hitler's generals were fully convinced of the imminent threat to the Pas-de-Calais area. The false tanks, however, were merely a visual element of a much larger psychological operation, a psychological warfare tactic of the highest order. The Germans weren't just fighting against an army. They were fighting against the very nature of perception itself. The more they investigated the intelligence, the more they were trapped in a false reality, carefully spun by the Allies. It wasn't just about making the Germans believe the invasion would happen elsewhere. It was about manipulating every sense, from sight to sound, and planting doubt in the minds of their command. The success of Operation Fortitude wasn't just an Allied victory on the battlefield. It had massive implications for the outcome of World War II. By convincing the Germans to divert resources, the Allies were able to establish a beachhead in Normandy, which would serve as the launch point for the liberation of Western Europe. As the Allies surged forward, their troops faced a much smaller, disoriented German defense force. The tactical advantage that the fake tanks and the elaborate network of misinformation provided couldn't be overstated. It gave the Allies not just a military advantage, but the upper hand in morale, as they knew they had outsmarted one of the most powerful armies in the world. The operation's success is also a testament to the evolving nature of warfare in the 20th century. This was a time when intelligence operations and the manipulation of information became just as important as battlefield victories. Deception, through tools like fake tanks and planted rumors, became one of the most powerful weapons in the Allies' arsenal. While armies clash on the ground, the battle of wits, of perception, and of information is often just as decisive. Operation Fortitude exemplifies the power of psychological warfare, showing how the greatest military minds of the time were easily misled by a few well-placed illusions. This operation wasn't just about fooling a general or a soldier. It was about manipulating the German High Command's entire worldview, making them see threats where there were none, and overlooking real threats where they existed. Through this, the Allies gained a strategic foothold, creating the conditions for their success. In the digital age, this kind of psychological warfare might seem like ancient history, but its lessons remain strikingly relevant. We still face misinformation, disinformation, and psychological manipulation every day. The same tactics that helped liberate Europe in 1944 could be the same that influence global politics today. This battle for perception is as crucial as ever. As the first waves of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, the real tanks were rolling forward, tanks that would breach the German lines. Meanwhile, the fake tanks, still positioned on a hill several miles away from the coastline, served their purpose silently. German officers, still reeling from the misinformation, scrambled to mobilize resources that would never be needed. Some of them even suspected that the fake tanks were just a diversion, but by then it was too late. The Allies were already in the midst of their invasion. With each passing hour, the real tanks advanced, while the Phantom Battalion sat idle, serving as a reminder of how a carefully executed deception had altered the course of history. The deception had worked. Normandy was secured. But the cost of this victory went beyond mere tactics. It illustrated the enormous power of misdirection, of the ability to make people believe something that wasn't true. The war in Europe would continue for another year, but the Germans were already on the defensive, their minds clouded by the false information. Months later, when the dust settled and the true scale of the deception became known, there were mixed reactions. Some saw it as a brilliant tactical move. Others realized just how much power perception could wield in the theater of war. In the end, the fake tanks were no longer needed. They were left behind, empty shells on a battlefield that would soon be occupied by the true forces of liberation. Yet the entire operation served as a testament to the intelligence, creativity, and cunning of the Allies. The real victory wasn't just on the battlefield, it was in the minds of those who were tricked into losing the fight before it even began. June 6, 1944, 0900 hours, Normandy Beach. The last of the fake tanks left behind by the Allies as remnants of a phantom army remain as silent symbols of a battle fought not with guns or bombs, but with the mind. And in the end, it wasn't the heaviest artillery or the most aggressive tactics that made the difference. It was the ability to make an enemy believe something that wasn't true. The tanks, long since abandoned, tell a different story than the one history remembers. They stand as a metaphor for a war won through deception, a reminder that in the grand theatre of conflict, perception is often the greatest weapon of all. In the heart of London, a small office was abuzz with the quiet intensity of British intelligence officers. Among them, Lieutenant Colonel John Bevan stood over a map of northern France, tracing out the imaginary locations of fake units. The detailed chart before him was more than a set of lines and coordinates. It was a blueprint for psychological warfare, the lifeblood of Operation Fortitude. Bevan's role was simple yet vital. Coordinate every piece of the grand illusion. The decoy tanks were only one part of the puzzle. The Allies also constructed entire fake airfields, complete with dummy airplanes positioned at regular intervals to mimic a massive build-up of forces. The goal was to make the Germans believe that a second front, one far more significant than the invasion at Normandy, was in the works. The success of this deception hinged on a seemingly trivial detail. The fake tanks had to be positioned just so, perfectly aligned to appear as an unmovable force from the sky, ready to strike. Bevan's work was meticulous, and every decision he made was based on the certainty that the enemy's mind could be swayed, not by force but by perception. But the deception wasn't confined to fake tanks and constructed military units. A crucial element of Operation Fortitude was the role of double agents, spies within the German ranks who fed false information directly to the Nazi leadership. One such agent, known as Garbo, real name Juan Pujol Garcia, was the perfect character for this intricate web of deceit. A Spanish-born, British-trained spy, Garbo became a linchpin in the operation. Through a series of carefully constructed lies and fake reports, Garbo convinced the Germans that the Allies were massing their forces in southern England, ready to make their move toward Pas-de-Calais. Over the course of months, Garbo earned the trust of the German High Command, feeding them precisely the kind of misinformation they needed to shift their attention away from Normandy. His reports were so convincing that he eventually gained the trust of German military intelligence, who believed that their spies in Britain had infiltrated a vast Allied network. Little did they know, Garbo was feeding them nothing but fabricated tales. It was a masterstroke in the art of deception, ensuring that, when the real invasion came, the Germans were convinced the Allies had a much larger force than they did. The success of Operation Fortitude wasn't just a triumph of technology, tactics, or misinformation. It was the result of a psychological strategy that had been perfected over the years. The Allies understood that warfare was as much a battle of minds as it was a battle of tanks and soldiers. The Germans, for all their military might, were conditioned to fight against what they saw as a logical and tangible threat. The Allies capitalized on this by constructing a narrative so deeply ingrained in the German psyche that the enemy's mind could no longer separate fact from fiction. The Germans, steeped in the belief that the Allies would strike at Pas-de-Calais, reinforced their defences there. They set up additional forces, more soldiers, and more tanks to safeguard what they perceived to be the most vulnerable point. Meanwhile, the Allies quietly built up forces in secret, with most of their strength landing on the beaches of Normandy. What the Germans never expected was the manipulation of their own psychology. The Allies used their perception of reality to their advantage. As a result, a massive Allied force, built on deception, was able to strike the weakest point in the German defences. History often celebrates military victories by the number of casualties, the strategic importance of battle sites, or the sheer might of weaponry. Yet in the case of Operation Fortitude, the victory was won through sheer psychological brilliance. It wasn't the real tanks, the real planes, or even the real soldiers that made the difference. It was the illusion of a threat that led to victory. The operation showed how perception could be more powerful than tangible weapons. It demonstrated that manipulating the beliefs and expectations of the enemy could alter the course of history. While warfare had traditionally relied on overwhelming force, the Allies proved that a well-crafted illusion could defeat even the strongest military machine. This lesson transcends war. In today's world, where information flows freely and rapidly, the line between fact and fiction can be dangerously thin. Just as the Germans fell victim to the Allies' deception, so too can modern societies fall prey to the manipulation of information. By the time the Germans realized the true scale of the Allied invasion, it was already too late. The first wave of Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, a feat that required extraordinary courage and sacrifice. As the soldiers landed under heavy fire, the deception that had begun months earlier paid off. The German forces, spread thin across multiple fronts, still preparing for an invasion that would never come, were caught off guard. The deception of the fake tanks, while seemingly small in the grand scheme of things, had given the Allies a fighting chance. It ensured that the bulk of the German military resources were deployed in the wrong locations, leaving Normandy vulnerable. The success of D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but the strategic brilliance of Operation Fortitude was an essential piece of that puzzle. As the tide of war turned in favor of the Allies, the tanks, fake and real, symbolized the shift from the devastating violence of the war to the strategic intelligence that would win it. In the aftermath of the invasion, the impact of Operation Fortitude was felt across Europe. The Germans had been so consumed by the illusion that they failed to see the true threat until it was too late. As the Allies advanced across the continent, they did so with the knowledge that they had fooled their enemies, an invaluable victory. But the operation wasn't just a success for the Allies. It raised questions about the nature of intelligence, deception, and warfare itself. The manipulation of perception had become a tool as powerful as any weapon, forcing the world to reconsider the way battles were fought and won. June 6th, 1944. 1,000 hours. Normandy beach. The sun now hung high over the once stormy waters of the Channel, casting long shadows. On the shores of history, the fake tanks, abandoned and forgotten, tell the story of a war that was fought not just with guns and tanks, but with the mind. And as the real tanks rolled forward, breaking through the German defences, the true battle was revealed, the one for perception, for control over what could be believed. In a sense, the victory at Normandy was a victory of the mind, a reminder that the greatest battles are not always fought with steel and fire. Sometimes they are won in the quiet of a workshop, under the careful hands of those who understand that perception itself can change the world. As the fake tanks stood idle in the open fields, a different kind of deception was unfolding in the minds of those in Britain. The operation's success wasn't just about military strategy, it was also about controlling the narrative. A series of carefully timed news reports, radio broadcasts, and even staged photographic evidence were fed to both the German and Allied public, painting a picture of an imminent invasion at Pas-de-Calais. The press, as controlled by British intelligence, played a vital role in amplifying the illusion. Media reports emphasized the build-up of military presence across southern England, all while reinforcing the false narrative that the Normandy landings were just a decoy. The Allies knew that to make the deception work, the Germans had to believe what they were seeing, not just from the battlefield, but from every front of information. Photographers were stationed at strategic locations to capture images of the dummy tanks and airstrips, knowing that these photos would find their way into German intelligence hands. The images were carefully staged, a column of fake tanks, complete with fake tire tracks in the mud, standing under the shadow of a real-looking military convoy. These visual cues were as much a part of the deception as the physical models of tanks on the ground. The story was being written not just on the front lines, but in every piece of information the Germans received. The success of Operation Fortitude would resonate far beyond the war. The manipulation of perception, whether through misinformation or the clever use of visual deception, became a core component of modern warfare. It was no longer enough to simply have the largest army or the most advanced weaponry. The ability to outthink the enemy by controlling what they believed was an invaluable asset. In the decades following World War II, Operation Fortitude was analyzed by military strategists, psychologists, and intelligence officers around the world. It became clear that deception was no longer a tactic used only in times of war. It was a tool of influence used by governments, corporations, and individuals to shape opinions, alter perceptions, and sway public sentiment. From Cold War propaganda to modern-day misinformation campaigns, the principles behind the Allies' fake tanks have been carried forward into new forms of psychological warfare. Even in the present day, deception remains one of the most powerful tools at a nation's disposal. The strategic use of perception, be it through fake news, manipulated imagery, or digital deception, has become a modern weapon, much like the rubber tanks of 1944. The battle for control over information, the manipulation of reality, is as prevalent today as it was when the Allies crafted their most ingenious ruse. The Allies' success with Operation Fortitude marked a defining shift in the nature of warfare. World War II was a war of technological innovation, but it also heralded a new era of psychological strategy. Before Fortitude, military operations were often defined by sheer force, tanks, bombers, and artillery leading the charge. But in the face of mounting pressure, the Allies realized that deception and misdirection could be just as crucial as the largest fleet of aircraft. They had learned, through trial and error, that manipulating the battlefield was about more than positioning soldiers. It was about creating an illusion of power and ensuring that the enemy's perception was altered in favor of your own success. The vast industrial scale of modern warfare also played a significant role in the success of Operation Fortitude. The Allies leveraged their industrial power not just to build real tanks and planes, but also to construct false ones. The deception was made possible by the industrial-scale production of dummy equipment and the extensive use of technology to create a sense of an overwhelming presence. As the war evolved, this form of psychological manipulation became an integral part of warfare, from the Cold War to modern-day cyber warfare. Operation Fortitude exemplified the power of deception in a world where perception can be more potent than reality. It wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about creating a psychological advantage, allowing the Allies to shape the narrative of war and force their adversary into a losing position before a shot was even fired. As the world moves further into the information age, the legacy of fortitude is more relevant than ever. Today, misinformation spreads at a rapid pace, facilitated by social media, artificial intelligence, and modern communication tools. What's real and what's fake can become difficult to discern, and in many cases, that uncertainty is exploited. The very same principles of perception manipulation that helped the Allies win the war are now used to influence elections, sway public opinion, and even alter the course of history. Just as the German generals believed they were facing a formidable army at Pas-de-Calais, so too do we often fall victim to false narratives crafted by unseen hands. The battle for control over perception is as fierce today as it was in 1944, and just as crucial to the outcome of our collective future. As dawn rose on the beaches of Normandy, the reality of the invasion was far different from the expected decoy force the Germans were expecting. The first wave of Allied forces began their assault under heavy gunfire, and as the roar of battle filled the air, the deception remained intact. On the other side of the battlefield, the German forces still believed the real attack was coming elsewhere. The fake tanks, positioned to create the illusion of a much larger force, remained unmoved, their hollow shells just as they had been left. But their impact was real. They had done their job, distracting the Germans, diverting their attention, and forcing them to commit forces to the wrong locations. Meanwhile, the actual Allied force surged ahead, striking the heart of Normandy, leaving the Germans scrambling to react to an invasion they never saw coming. The aftermath of this ruse was felt not just in the success of the landings, but in the years that followed. As the war wore on, the Allies' ability to use misinformation and deception continued to shape the narrative of World War II. The real story of Operation Fortitude wasn't just in the tanks. It was in the minds of those who believed they were seeing one thing, when in reality they were witnessing an illusion designed to ensure the survival of freedom. June 6, 1944, 10:30 hours, Normandy Beach. As the last of the Allied soldiers made their way inland, the sun continued to rise over a war-torn Europe, casting long shadows across the beach. The fake tanks, once the most feared force on the battlefield, now lay abandoned in the sand, their rubberized shells flapping in the wind. And yet, the real victory had been won elsewhere, in the minds of the enemy, in the careful manipulation of their beliefs. The true power of Operation Fortitude was not in the tanks, nor in the soldiers who landed on those beaches. It was in the truth that perception can be just as lethal as a bomb, and that victory can be shaped not by what is real, but by what the enemy believes to be true. As the deception unfolded on the ground, a crucial part of the operation was taking place far from the battlefield, in the secretive corridors of British intelligence headquarters. Behind closed doors, General Sir Bernard Montgomery and his team were finalizing plans for the real invasion, meticulously ensuring every detail of Operation Overlord was in place. The success of the deception was critical to this planning. The moment the German forces were pulled away from the real invasion site, the Allied forces could move in with minimal resistance. Every misstep, Every piece of misinformation was calculated to draw the enemy's attention elsewhere, leaving the Allies to storm Normandy with fewer casualties and more strategic advantages. At the heart of the Allied deception operation, there was one guiding principle: surprise. And to maintain that surprise, every element of Operation Fortitude had to be executed perfectly. The Allies knew that once the German forces were distracted, even for a few hours, it could spell the difference between success and failure. Montgomery, who would go on to lead the victorious D-Day forces, understood the stakes. As he looked over the carefully crafted map of Normandy, he knew the fate of the invasion, and of Europe, rested on a series of well-placed lies. The true genius of Operation Fortitude lies not in the physical deception, the fake tanks, the dummy planes, and the rubberized artillery, but in the understanding of human psychology and how it could be manipulated. The Germans, who prided themselves on their superior military intelligence, were blind to the psychological warfare being waged against them. They believed in their own perceptions of reality, and this belief would ultimately blind them to the truth. The deception worked on multiple levels. The physical presence of the fake tanks, their lifelike appearance, was only one aspect of a much deeper psychological operation. The Allies didn't just fool the German generals. They created a sense of paranoia and doubt within the German ranks. The constant barrage of conflicting intelligence, the sight of an overwhelming force in the wrong location, and the realization that their own intelligence had failed them, created a cognitive dissonance that weakened the Germans' resolve. At the heart of this strategy was an understanding of human behavior, that people, especially those in positions of power, are often willing to believe what they want to believe. The Germans wanted to believe that the Allies would attack Pas-de-Calais. They were invested in that belief, and the Allies exploited that cognitive bias to their advantage. This understanding of perception manipulation would go on to shape not just wartime strategies, but the way modern leaders approach negotiation, public relations, and even political campaigns. The manipulation of perception remains one of the most potent tools of influence, even in today's information-saturated world. As the tide of war turned in favor of the Allies, Operation Fortitude became a case study in the strategic importance of deception in modern warfare. The impact of this deception extended far beyond the shores of Normandy. The successful landing at Normandy opened up a new front in Europe, forcing the Germans to fight a two-front war. But the psychological impact of the deception was even more profound. The Germans, demoralized by their failure to anticipate the invasion, struggled to regain their composure. And though they would mount fierce resistance in the months following D-Day, the seed of doubt had already been planted. This failure to anticipate the real threat in Normandy had significant consequences for the German war effort. Not only did it prevent them from successfully defending the beaches, but it also led to a breakdown in their strategic thinking. With their forces spread thin, the Germans found themselves struggling to adapt to the rapidly changing realities of war. Meanwhile, the Allies were able to consolidate their position, build their forces, and push inland. The deception ensured that the Allied invasion was not just a military victory but a psychological one, creating a momentum that the Germans could never fully counter. The broader strategic significance of Operation Fortitude lies in its ability to manipulate the enemy's perception on a global scale. It was a victory that didn't rely on the number of soldiers or tanks, but on the ability to orchestrate a convincing false reality. The lasting lesson of Operation Fortitude is not just that deception can win battles, but that perception itself is often more influential than tangible power. In war, as in life, what people believe can be just as important as what is true. The Allies' ability to manipulate the perception of the enemy was as critical to their success as any physical weapon. What's more, this ability to craft and control perceptions has continued to evolve in the decades following the war. In today's world, where images, headlines, and social media have the power to shape public opinion, the lessons of fortitude remain profoundly relevant. This operation is a reminder that perception isn't just about what you see, it's about what you believe you see. In the context of warfare, this lesson translates into the ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast an enemy by crafting a false narrative so convincing that it clouds the judgment of those who follow it. This principle of perception manipulation is as relevant in modern geopolitics, business, and digital warfare as it was on the beaches of Normandy in 1944. As the Allied forces pushed further into Europe, the full scope of Operation Fortitude became clear. The German military's response to the fake tanks and fabricated intelligence had been catastrophic for them. Instead of confronting the real invasion at Normandy, they were caught in a whirlwind of doubt, uncertainty, and miscommunication. The ultimate irony of fortitude was that the Allies had won the war not by overpowering the Germans with sheer might, but by making them believe they were facing a threat that didn't exist. The fake tanks, the decoy planes, the radio signals, all of them were part of a far larger strategy to manipulate the German leadership into making critical errors that would ultimately doom their war effort. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, the Allies were already deep in France, their beachhead firmly established, and the momentum of the war irrevocably shifted. The power of deception had proven itself once again as a key determinant of victory. In the years following the war, military strategists, historians, and intelligence officers would study Operation Fortitude for its groundbreaking use of deception. The operation's success reshaped how intelligence was used in warfare and spurred a new focus on psychological operations, psyops. The techniques developed in Fortitude laid the foundation for modern-day military strategies that rely heavily on information warfare and cyber tactics. The ability to manipulate the flow of information, create fake realities, and control the narrative has since become an essential tool in both military and civilian contexts. In the years that followed, the world witnessed the growing use of media and information to influence public opinion, sway elections, and alter the course of global events. Operation Fortitude had not only changed the course of World War II, it had changed the way the world would understand the power of perception. June 6, 1944. 1100 hours. Normandy Beach. As the final remnants of the fake tanks were abandoned, their once imposing presence now faded into the sandy soil of history, one question remains unanswered. How much of what we know to be true is simply an illusion? The tanks that never fired a shot, the planes that never flew, these empty symbols stand as quiet witnesses to a war fought not just on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who believed in them. The illusion, carefully crafted and precisely executed, is a testament to the power of perception, a reminder that the greatest battles are often won not with force, but with a carefully constructed truth. June 6, 1944, 1200 hours, Normandy Beach. As the dust of the D-Day invasion settled on the sands of Normandy and the battle cries of Allied soldiers echoed over the beach, one thing was clear. The true victors of the day were not just the soldiers who fought, but those who never had to raise a weapon at all. The fake tanks, the inflatable trucks, the phantom battalions, they remain scattered across the landscape of history, relics of an operation that reshaped the nature of warfare itself. Operation Fortitude wasn't just a clever deception. It was the culmination of an era-defining strategy, one where perception became a weapon as powerful as any bomb. In a world where facts and truth often seem malleable, the events of June 6, 1944 remind us of a simple yet profound truth, that in warfare and in life, what we believe to be true can be just as impactful as what is actually true. Fortitude showed the world that the real victory was not in the battle for territory or resources, but in the battle for the mind, a war where reality itself can be manipulated to win the day. This operation, rooted in the manipulation of perception, wasn't just a historical footnote. It became a blueprint for modern strategies in politics, media, and global conflict. It laid bare the power of deception and how, when wielded with skill, it could change the course of nations. What started as a plan to mislead German generals into positioning their forces incorrectly turned into a foundational lesson in the power of psychological warfare. The fake tanks that once stood proud on the Normandy coast have long since been forgotten by most, but their story lives on, reminding us that even in the most brutal of conflicts, the mind is as important as the weapon. As history continues to unfold, one thing remains certain: the battle for perception is never truly over. In the end, the fake tanks of Operation Fortitude weren't just symbols of a single operation. They were the quiet sentinels of a timeless lesson. The truth, or the illusion of it, is often the greatest weapon of all.